Hello, everyone. I see, oh boy, everyone was just allowed in. Um, if we could just have some reminders really quickly, because this is an interactive webinar, we want to make sure that everyone is able to mute themselves and make sure that please feel free to turn on your camera if you want during this, but just during the presentation, you are welcome to keep it off. Just as a full disclosure, this is our first time using the new webinar feature here on Teams. So we're really excited to try this, but also bear with us if there's any issues. If you are here and you're excited for this vid, please get in the chat and say hi, introduce yourself if you would like in the chat as well. I know there's people from all across our district here right now who are joining us for our first webinar and the first in our series of 250th kind of programming that we have this year. It's in the history department, government, all the other departments here. We're really excited to get started on this. And I'm really happy to be hosting our first speaker here, who was on my dissertation committee, Dr. Guy Chet, who is a professor of history at the University of North Texas. He teaches classes on early American and military history. His first book was Conquering the American Wilderness, and this was a study of English and American military culture. Addressing narratives of Americanization and Anglicization, it points to trends of cultural continuity between Old World and the New. This theme of transatlantic cultural cohesion is at the heart of his second book on Atlantic piracy and illegal trade, called The Ocean is a Wilderness, Atlantic Piracy and the Limits of State Authority, 1688 to 1856, as well as his latest book on the origins, nature, and ends of the American Revolution, The Colonists' American Revolution, Preserving English Liberty, 1607 to 1783. So we are so excited to welcome Dr. Chet, and we're really looking forward to this interactive participation. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, but this is also interactive as well. So when Dr. Chet kind of indicates, feel free to raise your hand and to join in to answer the questions as well. We see people from a lot of different campuses here in the chat, so welcome, and we're really, really excited to host you, Dr. Chet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chloe. I really appreciate the invitation, and I didn't know that I was honored to being the inaugural speaker, so I thank you for that too. One thing about the participation, I won't be able to see you raising your hand, like having the raised hand feature on Teams, or you raising your physical hand if you're on camera. So when we do kind of open it up to discussion, if you could just unmute yourself and speak, and I don't think there'll be too much. If we find that too many people are speaking at the same time, we can then adjust, but I think it'll be okay. So it's just that I won't be able to see you raising hands, etc. So as Chloe said, I'm a professor of early American history, and today we'll discuss for about 50 minutes or so, plus however much Q&A, why the American Revolution took place. What did Americans find so objectionable about the British Empire? I'll try to show you that we can get a better answer to this by reading what revolutionary Americans wrote, so that we're not misguided by revolutionary historians. Before we start, I want to clarify to those in the room who, like me, did not grow up in this country and didn't study this in high school. So it's kind of very basic things that most of you know, but some of you don't. I didn't know. When the Americans rebelled against Britain, they first published a Declaration of Independence in 1776, which is the first document in your handouts. Then, as they were fighting and winning the Revolutionary War, they wrote a constitution for the United States of America in 1781. This is what you see on the slide here. And that's a second document in your handout. This was the first Constitution of the United States, and it was called the Articles of Confederation. And then a few years after the war ended, they replaced this first Constitution with a second Constitution in 1788 called the Federal Constitution, which is the one that we still live under today. So here's the timeline. So the question for us is why Americans rebelled. Okay? So participation here. What are the explanations that we have for the revolution? You know, why did Americans rebel and separate from Britain? What are explanations that your teachers told you? What are the explanations that you tell your students or tell one another? And
No
I know that this is a
taxation
mixed crowd of both students and instructors. So
no taxation without representation.
right. Okay. So high taxes and representation. What else? Like, there are a number of explanations that people give, and they sometimes work with one another, and sometimes they compete with, they contradict one another. Okay, so um, one is high taxes. What else?
Favorable treatment to the West Indies over the Atlantic seaboard colonies.
That would be your explanation. Okay, but okay, so mistreatment by the British government. I know you've heard other explanations. How about kings? How about opposition to monarchy? Is that an explanation that you've heard in school, in college?
And someone in the chat saying wanting to continue to smuggle.
Okay, so economic liberty or economic restrictions by the British. So it kind of goes under high taxes. Basically, they wanted to regulate trade, tax it, etc. But look, you've heard. I know this because I've seen the textbooks and I've participated in classes both as an instructor and a student. Republicanism, you know, that Americans were Republicans and chafed against monarchy. There's an argument about religious freedom. If you've been attuned to the 1619 project from a few years ago, you've heard kind of an argument reiterated that's been already advanced since the 1980s or so about preserving slavery. You know, that the American Revolution was part of an effort of a concern about the stability and continuity of slavery. There's an explanation about Americans feeling distant, kind of that over the generations, Americans became alienated, is the term, from the mother country. Okay, that they developed their own identity because of the distance and the isolation of America. Okay. So, does this ring a bell? I mean, have you heard these explanations over the years in school, etc.? I can see you can put the handout in the. Oh yes, Chloe. I think could you put the
Yes,
handouts
I'm going to
in
do
the
that.
chat? I just saw somebody saying something in the chat. Okay, so all these explanations have been given over the years, and in some eras, one explanation is more prominent, in other eras, different explanations are more prominent. But some things just don't make sense about these traditional or these explanations that we've been exposed to over the generations. For example, American settlers had perhaps the most comfortable living standards and the lowest taxation rates in the Western world at the time. Okay? And even when taxes were raised, why would the elite, which led this rebellion, risk their wealth, their lives, and their social and political standing over mild tax hikes that they could easily pay 100 times over? Even more challenging on this tax front, if this was a tax revolt, then why were Americans so angry about the Tea Act, the straw that broke the camel's back, given that the Tea Act eliminated the tax on tea? It made tea cheaper. Okay. On the republicanism front, okay, if Americans were opposed to monarchy, why were they so silent on it throughout the colonial era? Okay. We don't see throughout up until the outbreak of the revolution itself, we don't hear complaints about monarchy. Okay. In fact, the rebels themselves declared their loyalty and love for the king during even as late as the first year of the war, the first year of the rebellion. And American settlers enjoyed an unprecedented degree of freedom of religious worship, certainly in the Western world, but even compared to England. Okay. On the slavery front, if Americans went to war in order to preserve slavery, why did half of the states abolish slavery during or immediately after the war? And if they did not feel British, if they did sense this sense of growing distance and alienation from the mother country, why did they repeatedly and vociferously refer to themselves as British and express patriotic pride in Britain's cultural, political, economic, and military accomplishments on the world stage? Okay. So there are historians who disagree with all these explanations, and they argue with the textbooks when they meet their classes. And I'll try to convince you of kind of a contrary argument about why the revolution took place, but I don't want you to think to walk away thinking that it's because I think I'm some sort of a genius, and all these other historians who've given these other explanations just don't understand American history. Many of them, most of them, are more accomplished and more decorated than I am. The reason historians disagree is not that some know history and others are ignorant or dumb, but because different historians look at different evidence. Okay? They read different sources, as we will do today. And this is exactly why there's so many different explanations for this revolution. However, I do think historians are encouraged to keep on digging for new explanations. If this explanation doesn't work, let's look for another one, let's look for another one, because something about these explanations that you see here just doesn't add up. Right? If these explanations were satisfying, credible, then there wouldn't be such a demand for more books and more explanations. So why did Americans rebel? If it's not these things, then what was it? And the nice thing when you come to investigate something like this is that it's not a big mystery. They told us why. Okay? The revolutionists told us in their written complaints against Britain, in petitions asking the king to help them, pamphlets riling the people into resistance, and eventually in that written Declaration of Independence that you have in your hands, in which the rebels explained back in real time why they were doing what they're doing. However, they also explained themselves on the pages of that first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And again, the second document in your handouts, which, again, they wrote as they were fighting this war. This is a real-time account of their complaints, and that's what we'll examine today. But before we discuss this Constitution, I want to discuss what constitutions are and why countries write constitutions. So, what is a constitution? You all live in the country with the oldest constitution on earth, which is constantly in the news. So I know that you know what a constitution is.
The Constitution is a governing charter that establishes a government.
right. So you're right that it's a charter. It's kind of a blueprint. It explains what the government can and cannot do. In our case, what does the king do? What does parliament do? What does local government do? Um, the government's how the government relates to the church. What exactly is the nature of that relationship? Um, but before we describe what a constitution does, what does it mean? What does the word mean linguistically? Why do we call, if a government is a blueprint or a charter for a government, why do we use the word constitution? What does the word mean? You're all English speakers. I know you know this.
I don't know, like a condition, the condition I'm in, if I'm my constitution.
Well, my constitution in a physical sense or in a health
Uh,
sense refers to, again, it's the same process of borrowing. It refers to how something is constituted, how it's built, how it's structured. Okay, so how the body is structured, and when what's a proper constitution, what's your how does your um, body function compared to how it is structured? And the same thing here. We use the word constitution because we're referring to how this government is structured, how it's built, how it works. Okay, um, and what this
Oh,
means. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry, I was coughing.
Oh, um, so what this means is that all governments have a constitution. Okay? All governments have a structure. All governments are built a certain way, okay, and are constituted a certain way, and have rules that decide how they work. Okay, which branch of the government does what the government can and cannot do, the government's relationship with the church, etc. Okay, so all governments have a constitution, and some governments, like the United States, choose to write it down on a piece of paper. Okay, so it's not that democracies have written constitutions and non-democracies don't. Because today, almost all the countries in the world have a written constitution. Democracies like the United States and Holland have written constitutions, and non-democracies like Zimbabwe and China and Cuba also have written constitutions. And really a handful of countries in the world don't have a written constitution. Some of them are democracies like New Zealand or England or Israel, and some of them are non-democracies like Saudi Arabia. So it doesn't have to do with democracy or non-democracy. The point is that all countries have a constitution, and some countries choose to write it down in a single document, whereas others leave it unwritten. Okay? Up until about 100 years ago, most countries didn't have a written constitution, and for a variety of reasons, the last 100 years has seen an explosion of written constitutions. I'll just give you an example of how every country has a constitution. If you've ever taken a class or read a book on Roman history, you've heard historians discussing the Roman constitution. But no one is suggesting there was no Roman document that explained how the Roman government worked and how a bill becomes a law, how war is declared, what part of the government does what, etc. There was no Roman constitutional convention that decided the structure of the Roman government. Okay? Instead, it was the Roman constitution was a set of inherited customs and precedents that outlined for Romans at the time how we do things around here. Okay? So when historians talk about the Roman constitution, this is what they mean. Okay? A general understanding among Romans about the constitution of the government, the structure, the function of their government, explaining again, how the government works. So think of it this way. Every organization, the company you work in, the church you belong to, the garage band that you play in, and the family that you belong to, every one of these organizations has a constitution. That is, each of these groups has a broad understanding of who's in charge of what the pecking order is, how different parts of the organization or the group relate to one another, who does what, etc. And again, some organizations write these rules on paper and post it somewhere so that newcomers can read this document and thereby learn the organization's structure or constitution. Whereas other organizations do not write it down, this constitution, and people just learn simply by observing and experiencing it in action. Okay, so for example, you and I both grew up in a family, and even though there was no written constitution, we understood that our family had a structure of power and authority that explained to everyone who did what in the family, what was allowed and disallowed. So it wasn't written on paper, but we knew the Constitution because we lived in this family and we knew its codes. Okay, so if I asked you, if I were interviewing you, anyone here who grew up in a family, what are the codes and rules that governed your family? And I know every one of you grew up in a family, so you know the answer.
Respect your elders.
Okay. Okay, so the children need to be submissive to the parents.
My older brother always got his way.
Okay, good. So the elder siblings have a higher status and more rights or privileges than the younger ones. What else?
In my family, it was the opposite. I got away with everything my older sister
Okay,
did not.
okay. Look, and that's it. Different families have different constitutions. Okay, so in some families, the elder siblings are kind of co-parents and they're allowed to discipline or yell or even use violence, use force against the younger children. And in others, the parents protect the children from the disciplining or the force of the elder sibling. How about, again, this, if you think of the use of force, what are the rules in that respect in this family? Again, different families have different rules, different constitutions, just like different countries and organizations.
Be honest.
The what?
Be honest.
And we're
Oh,
saying
okay.
that parents can punish, kids cannot punish.
Right, right. Okay. So again, in some cases, elder children can punish the younger children, in some cases not, but it's definitely one way. Okay? The parents can punish in a variety of ways. The children are not allowed to do that in reverse. And the same goes for raising your voice. Okay, like somebody here said about respect. Okay, the parent can raise their voice to the child, but Lord help you if the child raises his voice to the parent. Okay, what other rules kind of define the family constitution in your family?
We see some things in the chat. We see things like do well in school. And I mean, I would agree with that. If I did not do well in school, my parents were not, that was just a given. Be back home before dark, honesty, doing your best also when you're in sports.
How about the parents? So these are all rules that, again, the establishes the children have a responsibility. For example, the children don't have a responsibility to bring money into the home. Again, different rules for different families and different eras, of course. But they do have a responsibility to do well in their in their job, meaning school or sports or whatever else. Okay. For
So
the
yes, we're
parents,
saying like
it's
provide shelter, clothes, food.
exactly okay. So the parents, if when the parents earn money, it behooves they're required by the Constitution to give it to the family. Okay, to give to buy shelter, food, services, etc. By contrast, if the children earn money, again, some families, especially poor families, expect the child to contribute that money to the family, to the parents, to give that money to the parents. Others don't. Okay? So all these rules and many, many more, that's your family's constitution. Okay, and different families are built differently and constituted and have a different constitution. But if we wrote down all these rules, it would read like a country's constitution. And the same holds true if you think of, again, a family is something that you're born into, born into this structure of power. But if you think of, again, I don't know how many students are here compared to instructors, but if you're a student who lives with roommates, or if you used to be a student who lived with roommates, that's a different kind of organization. Um, what kind of constitution does that organization have? What's the constitution of a group of people sharing a house?
They would
Let me ask
probably
you.
be splitting
Mhm.
expenses. Everyone, it would be more democratic as far as who is making decisions about the home, not using each other's things.
Perfect. Okay, so first of all, there's a basic agreement already in the fact that we're sharing the home, that we're all contributing to the rent. Okay, and again,
Respecting
different groups will have different ways of calculating it. Some would say everybody's paid equally. Others say, well, the person with the big room contributes more. Different ways of doing it. What else?
respect each other's spaces.
Okay. Okay. So there's kind of a freedom of movement here. Okay. That each that even though we all share the house, my room is mine, and you do not have the freedom to enter it unless I invite you in. Okay. So it's unlike the family where we really do all share this house and have access to the whole house. This is a different kind of thing. Okay. How about, is it okay to be loud when is it okay to be loud in the house? Who cleans the house? Is it okay to bring girls or boys over? Or actually, this is good. Things that we all, so the rent we all pay together, but how about things that we all use together, like toilet paper and milk and detergent? Okay. Does each one of us buy himself, or do we buy these things together and use them together?
And I really love in the chat to do your own dishes. Yes. If
Yeah.
anyone's ever had roommates, they're like, oh my
Right.
goodness, yes.
Okay. So in order to live and work together, groups establish rules for how we're going to live and work together, whether it's in a factory or a family or a house that we're living together for a while. In the British Empire, like all states and all empires and all families, also had a constitution. Again, it was not written down on paper. Instead, like the Roman Constitution, it was just broadly known that the king has this role in the empire, parliament has this role, colonial governments had that role. So, so when the church had that role, its own role. So when American colonists accused Britain of violating the law and violating the imperial constitution in the decades before the revolution, they were accusing the British government of violating this broadly understood, this consensus on how the empire was constituted and how governmental power should be wielded in our common area, in our common apartment that we're sharing here. Okay. And so the question is, again, if all countries have a constitution, and if the British Empire had a constitution, and if your apartment has a constitution, your shared apartment has a constitution, then why do people ever write down these constitutions? Okay. If countries can and do have unwritten constitutions, then why do other countries write their constitutions on paper? Okay. If you and I can know our family's constitution without it being written on paper or in the shared house, why write it down?
Accountability.
Meaning what?
You're agreeing to it, so someone can call you on it.
Right. It's a kind. You can no longer claim ignorance. Okay. It's a declaration. It's like signing a kind of contract. Okay? You agree implicitly that these are the rules of the road here. Okay. If there's a note on the fridge in the apartment, if this note that, can you see this note? I need a yes or a no. Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So if there's a note on the fridge at the apartment that you share with your roommates saying, don't take other people's food, what does this note tell you as evidence about what's happening in this house?
Somebody's eating someone else's dinner.
Exactly. Okay. I thought that we all knew. I thought that there was a consensus here that you don't take fridge food that doesn't belong to you. But once I noticed that my roommates were stealing my food, I was compelled to write down this previously unwritten rule. Okay, we didn't used to have this note on the fridge. I put it on the fridge because this unwritten rule was violated. Okay? And then by contrast, when you notice that I don't clean up after myself in the kitchen, you write that on a note. Okay, clean up after yourself, wash the dishes. Okay, I'm pretty sure the apartment is full of Post-it notes outlining the do's and don'ts of this apartment. Okay, so when too many people violate the unwritten rules, they stop being unwritten rules and they're written down. Okay? And one of the striking features of the American Revolution is that it unleashed a flurry of written constitutions. As soon as the states declared their independence, all of them, without exception, all of them started writing constitutions for themselves. And then the United States as a whole, together as a collective organization, also started writing a constitution for itself in the Articles of Confederation that you're holding, or a summary of it. And it makes sense that this happened for the same reason as it does with the roommates in the fridge. Okay? Because the British government demonstrated with its actions that it did not know or did not understand the imperial constitution, the Americans wrote down and posted the previously unwritten rules in order to ensure that future governments, our governments, will be accountable, as you said, on what our rules are and, again, how we do things around here. Okay, so written constitutions clarify the rules for everyone, okay, for people who are already here but forgot the rules, and for newcomers who don't know our rules because they're new to our family, like a new child or somebody who married in or something like that, or they're new to our apartment, or they're new to our country. Okay, so written rules make it easier to live together because nobody can claim not to know, which means that now we can punish people for violating the rules. So that explains kind of sociology, or in terms of poli sci, why there's this move towards from unwritten constitutions to written constitutions. But for us as historians, looking back on past societies, written constitutions tell us what bothered those people back then. So when countries go from unwritten constitutions to written constitutions, they're telling us what unwritten rules were broken. Okay, just like the note on the fridge. And this is why the Articles of Confederation are so useful to us in explaining why Americans rebelled. Because as we've established at the beginning, it's quite difficult to explain what this revolution was all about, even after hundreds of years and hundreds of books written about it. So do me a favor. So, if you've already looked at the Articles of Confederation, at the handouts, then good. If you haven't, take a look at the summary of the first American Constitution, and read it like we read the note on the fridge, and see what it tells you about their complaints. Okay, when you look at this note on the fridge at the first Constitution, what does it tell you about their complaints that drove them into rebellion? So when you look at these now written rules, what do they tell you about what the British government did that was so upsetting that Americans wanted to make sure that the United States government never does these things in the future? Because look, you can ignore the first item, obviously. It just tells you the name of the organization, the United States of America. But what does item 2 say? What does item 3 say?
So in the chat, we're saying infringement on sovereignty, freedom, independence, and thanks, Nancy, like for the note. Did you not notice that we don't want a king here?
um, so, so look, you're right. It says that it clarifies, again, with the same logic. If you see a note on the fridge saying, don't take other people's food, it means that somebody took other people's food. Item 2 tells us that the British government violated the freedom and independence and jurisdiction of various colonies. Item 3, what does item 3 suggest to you happened here? Like, what's the complaint? What do they not want the central government to do, the British government to do? Or in the future, what are they complaining about what the British government did in the past and want to make sure that the American government doesn't do in the future?
Having sovereignty over them and just having too much control over individual states.
Exactly. So item 3 tells us that the British government tried to behave like a sovereign government over the different colonies. Okay, and it's telling us that's a violation of the imperial constitution. It shouldn't have done so. And so now that we're forming our own collective government, we're now putting it on paper so that nobody makes this mistake again. The central government should not is not a sovereign government over the different states. And if you go down the list again, more of these rules point out what the complaints about the past. For example, if you look at item 8, it tells us that the British government tried to legislate tax laws for the colonies as a sovereign government would do. And it says no more of that. Okay? This is not a sovereign government, and therefore it just to clarify to those dummies who don't know, you're not authorized to pass laws for the different states, okay, or the colonies within the British Empire. So you can see here that the first US Constitution denied to the American central government everything that revolutionary Americans denied the British central government. Now, I won't have you read through all the complaints, an endless list of complaints in the Declaration of Independence to see that they match all the complaints that you've just seen on the pages of the items of the Articles of Confederation. And especially, you'll see the most prominent complaint is the Declaration's complaint about the British Parliament extending unwarrantable jurisdiction over us, meaning meddling in local affairs that are not theirs to meddle in. Okay? Unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. So instead of just going through all this whole list of complaints in the Declaration and seeing how it matches the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, instead I want to show you how reading the Articles of Confederation closely and seriously gives us a new explanation about the Revolution compared to the explanations that we listed at the beginning of today's session. These reasons. These explanations. The reason our historians give all these problematic or unsatisfying or incomplete explanations about the Revolution is because our histories and textbooks mostly ignore the Articles of Confederation. The first American Constitution gets mentioned as one or two paragraphs bridging the end of the war to the beginning of the drafting of the second Constitution, the Federal Constitution. Okay. So we race ahead to study in depth the second Constitution, which is our Constitution under which we live today, and we pay little attention to the Constitution that the revolutionists created for themselves when they created this country, which is completely understandable. I'm not blaming us for caring more about our country today and our Constitution than about the country that they established for themselves with their revolution and their Constitution. But it does mean that we're not making an effort to understand them and their motives, right? Because we're more fascinated with our United States of America. So when our histories and our textbooks guide us to zoom past the first Constitution, we end up with these different explanations on this slide here, all of which tell a story about how Americans changed over time. Okay? All these explanations here tell us that English settlers came to America, and then life in America changed them generation by generation. Okay? They changed, they adopted new and intense beliefs on monarchy and on taxes and on religion and on slavery, etc. Okay? Generation by generation, they became more and more different from the mother country that they left behind. And eventually these growing differences erupted into an ugly divorce. This is the formulation that Gordon Wood uses in one of the most famous and influential books written on the Revolution. For Wood, the Revolution was generations in the making. And the final chapter of this progression, and the bow that wraps it all up, was the creation of the second Constitution. So this is 5 or 6 years after the war ended. Okay. So this is the federal Constitution, the one that founded our federal government in 1789, with George Washington as our first president. And that, okay, that second constitution and Washington's government, etc., that completed the story of America winning its independence. So when our historians and our teachers end the story of the revolution this way, in 1788, 1789, with the formation of the new federal government, they see the revolution as a story of change. And they compelled their students also to see a revolt by people who had changed and were creating a new nation with a new system of government and a new philosophy of government to match their new ideas. Because there's no doubt that the federal constitution, the second constitution, certainly was that. Right? It drew up a brand new and innovative system of government, and it created a new and sovereign country in North America. But what's hidden from view in this storyline is the first constitution. Okay, so you've now read this constitution, and you know that when Americans rebelled, they did not want a new system of government or a new philosophy of government. And they definitely did not want to create a new and sovereign country in North America. Just to kind of go back over our bases, but what tells you that they did not want the United States government to be a sovereign power? It's in the text there, it's not hidden. History, despite what they say, is not complicated. Just go over what we've already done with the articles. What tells you that Americans did not want the United States to be a sovereign power?
The second point on the Articles of Confederation.
Right. Okay. And the second point, and especially the third point, okay, it says the United States of America is not a sovereign government. It is a league of friendship between 13 sovereign and independent states. So when we bother to stop and really consider the Constitution that they enacted when they were fighting and winning the war, we can see that the revolutionists had a different understanding of their revolution than we do. Okay? They saw the Articles of Confederation as the end of the revolution and the purpose of the revolution, which makes the revolution look very different. Remember how I told you that historians disagree because they focus on different sources or different evidence? Yeah, this is a great example of it. Because the reason Gordon Wood sees a change revolution is because he sees the revolution ending at way in the future in 1789. Right? So he devotes his attention to that second constitution that was ratified in 1788. If he thought that the revolution ended in 1783, he would devote himself to the first constitution. And as a result, he'd write a very different history of the revolution. When the story of the revolution ends with the American victory in the war and the ratification of this first constitution, we no longer see a story of gradual generational change. Instead, the story that the Articles of Confederation tell us is a story of English colonists living happily and prosperously and patriotically within the traditional structure or constitution of the British Empire. Okay, this was a decentralized empire in which English settlers governed themselves locally, according to those unwritten rules of the imperial constitution. This was the model of empire that was referred to at the time as a system of salutary neglect, a system of strong local governments under a weak and unimposing central government in London. Today we refer to this model as a model of what's okay, we refer to it as a model of states' rights, same structure of government. Um, so so it was forever a decentralized empire, a salutary neglect empire, a states' rights empire, with English settlers governing themselves locally. And then suddenly, one decade before the revolution, Britain began changing the rules, trying to change the structure or the constitution of the empire, trying for a decade to transform the empire into a centralized empire, governed from the center at the expense of self-government in local communities. And in the process, it ignored all the unwritten rules of the imperial constitution. It meddled in local affairs. It restricted the jurisdictions of local courts of law. It invaded the jurisdictions of local legislatures. It enacted laws for the colonies. And it deployed imperial soldiers as a police force for the first time in the colony's history. Okay? And that's when the friction started. Okay, so the separation from Britain, according to this story, was not generations in the making. It was not gradual. It came abruptly in that one decade before the revolution. And most important, it's not because Americans changed, but because Britain changed, or the British government changed. Okay, so the disagreement between these camps of historians is over what caused this breakup. Okay, it's like two marriage counselors arguing about what caused this divorce. Okay? Gordon Wood and his camp say that the marriage broke up because the husband changed. And the other camp of historians, Jack Green and others, I'm representing this camp here today, the other camp of historians is saying that no, it's not that the husband changed, the wife changed. Okay, they're both diagnosing what went wrong in this marriage. What's responsible for its malfunctions? So in this story of the country's founding, the Americans did not change. They were British, and they remained British, and they rebelled because they were British, not because they had become different. And they rebelled not to promote change, but to resist change, not to create a new system of government, but to preserve the old system of government. Okay, so think back to that roommate who wrote that note on the fridge. Okay, the note on the fridge is not a new rule or a new system of government in this apartment. It's an old rule. Okay, it's the way we've always done things around here. Okay, the roommate who posted that note hadn't, we don't look at him and say, man, he's changed. Okay, he didn't change. He's not trying to change the way we do things in this house. He's trying to preserve or restore the old rules that we've always had here. Okay? And with that, I'd like to end by defining the term revolution in the same way that we defined constitution. Okay? So what does the word revolution mean? What do we mean when we say revolution? You all say it. I know you know it.
Like to change the political situation for whatever reason deemed necessary.
Mm-hmm. Good. But to go from the way we have it now to something new. Okay? So by revolution, modern people, we mean some sort of a fundamental change that moves us from an old system to a new and different system in political institutions or social customs or technology. And think of all the revolutions that we refer to: an industrial revolution, a market revolution, so the sexual revolution. What other revolutions can you think of? The AI revolution. So to us, revolution means fundamental and radical change. It destroys something old and replaces it with something new and better. Okay, so if I drew a diagram of a revolution, it would look like this. Okay, it's an arrow leading from A to B, forward and upward towards progress. Okay, but again, what does the word revolution mean? Just linguistically, what does the word actually mean? Not the political meaning of it, but the linguistic meaning of it.
To go around in a circle, like a merry-go-round, a revolution. Yes, go around something. Yeah.
Exactly.
I see rotation going around, like the sun going, yeah, or the planets going around. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, like the revolution of the Earth. It comes from the word revolve. Okay, it means not a forward movement in a straight line to something new, but a 360-degree movement that brings you back to where we started, like a revolving door or RPMs on an engine. So, so you know, after a revolution, again, if you think of it in this respect, after the revolution of the Earth around the sun, we're back to where we started. Okay, it's a reset. It's a restoration of the original setting, or a revolving door. Okay, so that's the meaning of the word revolution. The French Revolution changed the meaning of what we imagine, what a revolution looks like, from a circular motion to a straight line, because the French Revolution destroyed and burned and beheaded the old system and created a brand new system. So the French Revolution, regardless of its name, looked very much like that straight line. France looked completely different after the revolution. Okay? Those who were down were now up. Those who were up were now dead. With radical change in every part of public and private life. Okay? And because the French Revolution was so monumental and influential, that's the image that we now have of what a revolution looks like. Okay? But the French Revolution erupted in 1789, after the American Revolution already ended. So in the era before the French Revolution, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, the term revolution described a restoration of the original setting, of the way things used to be, going back to the starting point. So when the English rebelled against their king in 1688, in what they called the Glorious Revolution, and when the Americans rebelled against Britain in 1776 in what they called the American Revolution, why did they use this term? Why did they choose to refer to waging war against a lawful government as a revolution? What were they conveying with that, with the terminology that they attached to these rebellions?
A return to something?
Yeah, but so again, they understood it as, look, like you said, we're just returning to the way things used to be. Okay, we're not destroying our system of government and creating something new. We're restoring the way things used to be. But why was it important for them to clarify, hey, this is a revolution? Okay, this is not change. We're restoring the way things used to be. Why was it important to clarify that? Think of the guy with the note on the fridge.
In the chat, we see returning to an era of salutary neglect, but also that the word revolution sounds better than the word treason as well.
Well, actually, exactly. Look, the term revolution conferred legitimacy on armed revolt against the government by advertising that, hey, this is not radical. It's in fact traditionalist. We're not changing anything. We're just restoring the way we've always done things around here. Okay? We're not changing the system. They changed the system. We're upholding the good old constitution, the good old way of living together here. Okay, so look, 18th century people were not like us with regard to change. Okay? We see change as a good thing. They did not. Okay? They viewed change negatively, or at the very least, suspiciously. Okay? The conventional explanations that we've listed before about the revolution paint the American response to British taxes, pretty small taxes too, as paranoid, hysterical, radical, because the response was completely disproportional to the offense. Just think of it. Who goes to war against the greatest military power in the world, in the history of the world, over pretty slight tax hikes? Okay, because the American response was so out of proportion to the offense, it leaves us scratching our heads because we know that those revolutionary leaders that we all know, we know that they were not radicals and hysterics and paranoids. Okay? They're pretty serious and sober people. Okay? Plus, too many things just don't line up with these explanations, as we've discussed before. By contrast, this reading of the revolution, the one that follows the rebels' own account of what they were doing and their terminology and their constitution, this reading of the revolution paints it not as a tax revolt, not as a war of national liberation, not as an effort to preserve slavery, not as an effort to launch a new system of government that's never been tried before. Instead, it tells us the story of conventional Englishmen of their day with understandable fears and reasonable complaints when they saw their government acting lawlessly. Okay, they were not radicals trying to overthrow the status quo, but traditionalists who were trying to restore the status quo, to restore the old and good imperial constitution against newfangled and unconstitutional government reforms initiated in London. Okay, they tried to restore the old imperial constitution within the British Empire for a decade with petitions and demonstrations, etc. And when that failed, they restored that old and good constitution outside the British Empire as the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Chet. If there's anybody with any questions, please let us know. And also, we are going to be putting that attendance link in here as well today so that everyone is here can get that professional development credit. Make sure to go and update in the Learn Center that you attended today. Oh, Alan, thank you. Put it in there. Thank you, Alan. And if there's any questions in here, I was wondering myself, I just recently read Republic and Empire, Crisis Revolution in America's Early Independence by Trevor Bernard and Andrew O'Shaughnessy. And I feel like this has there's just so much connection between current scholarship right now that is trying to unravel and debunk some of these myths, especially looking globally. So do you think that this is a moment to look at the revolution more broadly to try to understand some of these motivations as well. And what do you think like the trends are as we're heading to 250?
No, I think the trends are more in the other direction, because the Gordon Woods narrative and all the other narratives that I listed on that slide are explanations that present themselves when you look when you look at the revolution from a national within a national scope. Um, and so within a national scope, what you're getting is glimpses or evidence of Americans changing, okay, in whichever way, their attachment to slavery or their attachment to rights or their attachment to land or who knows what. By contrast, if you look from an imperial scope, so the historians who debunk or disagree, not debunk, who offer this alternate explanation, this more English explanation, overwhelming, I would say 100% of them, but I don't want to stake my reputation on it, but the vast, vast, vast majority of them are not American historians, but imperial historians. And so when you look at the American Revolution through an imperial lens, then things look different. And my sense is that the weight of scholarship has been ever since the late 19th century, definitely in the 20th century, increasingly American. And so the result is that we get more explanations that work within the narrative of Americans changing, and that's what explains the coming of the revolution. But like I said, I think I'm an imperial historian, and so I see things differently, and my diagnosis of the fact that of the fact that we're getting a stream of books and explanations and documentaries that try out new explanations is because these explanations are unsatisfying on some level, which is why they're not satisfying. And so we need, okay, wasn't this some other explanation of how Americans are changing? When in fact, if you broaden your scope, you'll see a completely alternative framework in which Americans have never changed, which I think is more, well, to me, it's more convincing. But again, it's not. It all depends on the how wide your canvas is, and so basically the debate between us is between, let's say, Jack Green and Gordon Wood is which canvas, which lens is more appropriate. And again, there's perfectly good reasons to look through an American lens, perfectly good reasons to look through an Atlantic or imperial lens. But to your question, I think Americans are interested in their society and their country, especially on the 250th Jubilee. And so I think the weight of scholarship is on the American side.
So we have a question from Eric Walker, who says the presentation lists reasons why Americans rebelled against Great Britain. Curious as to the British point of view, why do they think Americans rebelled?
My sense, again, in English schools, etc., my sense is that they have the same explanation. That Americans had changed. The experience of life in America was transformative on the culture and identity of Americans. And if so I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up in Israel. I came here just for graduate school. And I used to think that the fact that I wasn't a product of the American school system meant that I was I had a fresh look on things, and I wasn't trapped by American scholarship on this stuff. But after years of living here and after becoming a professor and kind of becoming more familiar with the scholarship, the breadth of scholarship, I realized that actually in Israel, I got the same narrative of the American Revolution that Americans get here, and for good reason. Israeli um, Israeli curriculum in high school and in college is based on American scholarship on American history. Just like if I were studying German history or French history or or Dutch history, I'm just getting the product of Dutch and French and German scholarship on Dutch and French and German history. It's just that it's translated into English, but I consume the perspectives and the understand and the the wisdom of German historians about German history. So so given the fact that every nation's historians dominate that nation's history writing, it makes complete sense why everyone in the world gets the American-centered narrative of America. And it makes intuitive sense too, because everyone who lives in the world today already knows the United States of America as a different animal. Okay, it's a Western society, but the Americans are completely quirky compared to the rest of the West. And so, it's a country with its own weird institutions, its own weird political philosophy, its own culture, its own music, et cetera, et cetera. So its own bizarre sports. And so everyone already knows Americans as different. And so when they read histories that talk about how Americans changed culturally, it makes complete sense to everyone, including in England.
All right, Dr. Little, do you want to ask your question right now? You can unmute yourself. If not, I can read it for you. I just thought maybe you could say it better.
Okay, sorry. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on some of the more radical revolutionaries, people like Sam Adams, especially the more propaganda part of it. Were they some of the earliest conspiracy theorists in U.S. history, given the narratives of enslavement and all the terror rhetoric that they utilized in a lot of what they did?
Uh, no, look, the 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 word enslavement is kind of is jarring to us because we think um, of slaves who are used for their labor, but that rhetoric of government oppression being a form of enslavement is something that has 1,000 or more years of history in European rhetoric. Look, they were not conspiracy theorists in the sense that when you look at what's called the Second British Empire, what the British Empire in the century that followed the loss of the American colonies, you see that the accusations that Americans leveled at the British government were correct. The British government really did see in that, it really did come to see in that decade that preceded the American Revolution, they came to be very frustrated with their this inefficient empire that they had. When they looked at the Spanish Empire or the French Empire, they saw a very well-governed empire structured from the center, where the king or the government can shape the reality on the ground, enforce the law, etc. And then they looked at their own empire, and it's a complete mess. We pass laws, nobody enforces them. We try to enforce them. We have communities undermining our courts, the jury system, lets off smugglers scot-free. And so they really did try to centralize the to centralize the administration of the empire, to make it more accountable to the central government and less accountable to local populations, local governments. And so that's what Americans were complaining about. Hey, what are you doing here? For example, like what I said earlier about a police force. English people did not have police forces. And yet here in the colonies, in the decade before the revolution, suddenly these English people are subjected to a police force. It's completely radical development as far as they're concerned. So they were calling it out as, again, oppression, enslavement, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at how the British Empire developed itself, shaped itself afterwards, you see that the Second British Empire really was that kind of empire. It was governed from the center. Local ruling bodies were either weakened or abolished. And the Second British Empire looks looks very normal, very traditional, in the sense that it's an empire that governs population and tells them how it's going to be. So the Americans and the British government were not, nobody was hiding anything. The British really were trying to change the imperial constitution, and the Americans really were noticing and saying, hey, you're changing the imperial constitution. And they were both correct.
I guess just to follow up real quickly, I guess like I was thinking about the King's Proclamation in 1763 and how Adams really hammered home the idea that that was made to enslave them or keep them held, when in reality it was to keep them from antagonizing Native Americans and pushing further west and causing more debt and more problems. So I guess the exaggeration bit is more what I was focused on, like the murdered by British troops prior to the Boston Massacre that he had put out that wasn't accurate.
Well, look, when you fight a war, in terms of, again, talking about the British Proclamation of 1763 that you're asking about, just to explain to others. After they fought the French and Indian War, the British issued a proclamation saying that basically the Appalachians will now be the western border of the English colonies, and that territory that they fought in and fought over beyond the Appalachians, that will be reserved for the Indians and is no longer open to English settlement. Now think of it, if from the English perspective, from the English settlers' perspective, they just fought a war with their own government, with the imperial government, with the British Army, hand in hand, against the Indians and their French allies. And they've sacrificed blood and treasure for it, and they've won the war at great sacrifice. And as a result, and following that, the British government is saying, okay, you've given all that up, and now all this land that you've conquered, that will be given to your enemies who had just spent 7 years killing and slaughtering and everything against you. Okay, so they saw it as a tremendous betrayal, number one, and number two, as a violation of their charters, because the colonial charters included those Western territories. So they saw it, A, as an emotional betrayal, but more important to this point about enslavement, they saw it as a violation of the law. Okay, they saw it as yet another instance of the British government acting lawlessly, violating the imperial charters, the colonial charters that governed these colonies. And the same goes for the province of Quebec that was established at the same time. There was tremendous complaints about the province of Quebec, how the British structured the province of Quebec. And it's the Americans, the English settlers in the colonies, noticed that this new colony that the British are establishing is established without a parliament, without any representation for the colonists, and they saw it as, again, part of an imperial plan or imperial trend of ignoring the way we've always done things around here, where the people govern themselves, and where, again, the colonial charters hold true, have a legal standing, and instead the imperial government simply takes parts of the colonies and gives them to our Indian enemies, and takes other parts of our colonies and gives them to our French enemies, and sets up governments in which sets up provinces in which there will be no self-government and only government from London. And so, again, I'm not kind of saying that the Americans were right and they really were oppressed. The Americans are right in the sense that they were noticing that the British government was changing the rules. And the British government was saying, hey, we're changing the rules because these rules are ineffective, or they cause conflict with the Indians, or they cause smuggling or whatever else. But they were not inventing things. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was an observation that both sides were making and acknowledging.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. I do see we are kind of running down on time now. We have one from Dr. Jennifer Bridges, who is curious why the British didn't offer American colonists representation in Parliament, not virtual, but physical. Could have perhaps removed one of these arguments for independence.
So Jennifer sees it exactly like the same diagnosis as Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin suggested the same exact thing. And as soon as he did, so this is during the Stamp Act crisis, he gave a report to Parliament, and as an advocate of the British Empire, he said, look, the problem is constitutional. Okay, it's not the money. It's not that people can't afford the stamp to attach to their contracts. It's a constitutional issue. Americans think that you don't have the authority to pass laws for them because Englishmen understand English liberty as having a voice in their own taxation, in their own legislation. Okay? So the fact that Americans don't have a voice, a seat in Parliament, means that Parliament doesn't have the authority to pass laws for English people and Americans. So he said, let's solve this. Give them representation in Parliament, and you take away the only argument that they have against it, the real complaint. The heart of the complaint, he said, was constitutional, not economic. And as soon as Pennsylvanians heard that Benjamin Franklin was talking this way, they sent him messages saying, do not make any suggestions to this effect, to give us representation in Parliament. Okay? So when they said no taxation without representation, they didn't mean, hey, we want to be represented in Parliament so that Parliament can tax us. They're saying, look, we already have assemblies that govern us and tax us. Okay? We in Massachusetts or South Carolina, we have an assembly that we elect and it taxes us. And that's perfectly fine. And you in England, you have an assembly, parliament, that you elect and taxes you. Okay? To each his own. Okay, we don't want to be a part. We don't want a seat in Parliament, and for Parliament to tax us. And you don't want to have a seat in the South Carolina Assembly and have South Carolina Assembly tax British people in England. Okay? Everyone has their own assembly. We're perfectly happy with the way we've always done things around here, where every English population has an assembly that governs it and taxes it. So it was kind of a correct solution on Franklin's part, and it was a correct, or not a correct, but it touched on this issue that Look, they didn't want representation. They had representation. It's just that they saw themselves as living in South Carolina or New York or in Massachusetts. They understood the British Empire as a decentralized empire in which local populations governed themselves. And that clashed with the new idea of British administrators as to how they wanted their empire to be. It was increasingly frustrating for them to have this messy, primitive empire. They wanted a nice empire.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chet. Thank you for coming today. And for everyone here, we have another event with Dr. Andrew Lang in 3 weeks, where we are going to be comparing the coming of the revolution with things in the Civil War. So that's going to be really interesting. Hope everyone can make it to that. And then we have other programming to come ahead. Check it out in the Learn Center. And thank everyone. We'll give you a virtual round of applause and see you soon, Dr. Chet. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Thank you very much. Thanks.